When my daughter finally told me she was pregnant, I already knew. What I didn't know was how much she was suffering alone. My name is Anna. I'm 53 years old. I've been a mother for longer than I can remember myself without that title. And perhaps that's why I've learned to perceive things that aren't said. It wasn't a conscious test at first. It was intuition. She changed slowly. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would catch the eye of an outsider. But for a mother, it was all noise. The smile grew shorter. The clothes became looser. Tiredness arrived too soon. And above all, silence. Not that comfortable silence of someone at peace. It was a heavy silence, the kind that lingers in the air even when the house is full. I thought about asking. Many times. The words were on the tip of my tongue, but I swallowed them. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I wanted to understand. Because Ash wasn't saying that. Mothers learn early on that some truths are inescapable. They just need space to feel safe. So I observed. I waited. I created simple, pressure-free moments. Coffee on the table. Open-ended questions. Conversations that didn't require answers. And yet, she remained closed off. Sometimes I would see her sitting on the sofa, her hand on her stomach, staring into space. When she realized I had seen her, she would try to hide it. She would change the subject. She would smile too quickly. The people around didn't notice anything. They said it was just a phase. Tiredness. Age. But I knew it wasn't just that. I remained silent. And that silence hurt me more than it hurt her. Because there is no greater pain for a mother than realizing that her own daughter is carrying something so heavy, alone. At that time, I wasn't expecting a confession. I was expecting trust. And when she finally sat down in front of me, her eyes filled with tears, she took a deep breath and said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." I understood. That silence wasn't empty. It revealed fear, loneliness, and a pain that wasn't about the pregnancy, but about not knowing if she would be accepted. That day, I confirmed something I will never forget. Silence sometimes speaks louder than any words. I always say that my relationship with my daughter was built on silence and care. Not because there was a lack of love, but because, from an early age, I realized that she felt everything more deeply than she showed. When she was little, she was one of those observant children. She wasn't the noisiest, nor the one who drew attention, but she was the one who noticed when someone was sad, even without anyone saying anything. She would come, sit beside them, rest her head, and just stay there, present. I raised her practically alone. Her father was never physically absent, but emotionally, he was always distant. He was a decent, hardworking man, but harsh when it came to feelings. And without realizing it, my daughter learned early on that showing too much affection could lead to conflict, demands, or frustration. I tried to compensate for that with dialogue, affection, and acceptance. But there's a part of a person's development that doesn't depend solely on love, it depends on the environment where they learn to protect themselves. My daughter grew up to be too responsible for her age. She never asked for things. She never complained. She always tried to solve everything on her own. During her adolescence, I could tell when something wasn't right. She would come home quieter, lock herself in her room, and cry in the shower so no one would hear. When I asked if everything was all right, she always answered the same thing. "Everything's fine, Mom." That was the phrase she used to end any difficult conversation. And I respected it, even knowing that the response meant nothing. Over time, this became a pattern between us. Not out of a lack of trust, but out of fear. Her fear of disappointing me. My fear of pressuring her. I carried my own scars. I was raised in a home where being pregnant outside of the right time was a source of shame. Where women learned to endure in silence. Where mistakes became eternal labels. Even when trying to be different, I know that some things slip through because of how we look, react, or remain silent. And perhaps without realizing it, my daughter learned that certain truths needed to be carefully considered before being spoken. When she became an adult, our relationship was good. We talked about work, plans, everyday problems. But deep feelings, those always remained hidden. She was afraid of disappointing, afraid of making mistakes, afraid of not meeting expectations even when I never explicitly stated them. And it was this fear that I began to recognize when I noticed the changes in her. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She seemed to be carrying an invisible weight, a secret that couldn't fit in her chest, but that she still couldn't find the courage to let out. I saw in her eyes the same look I had in my youth when I had to face decisions that were too big for me to make alone. That look of someone trying to be strong, but just wanting to be supported. That's why I didn't ask. Not at that moment. Because I knew, if I asked too soon, she would answer what she thought I wanted to hear, not the truth. I needed her to feel safe, not pressured, not expected, not judged. I needed her to trust me, not as a mother, but as a refuge. And it was there, in that space between what I saw and what she hid, that I understood something painful. My daughter always smiled, but she didn't always feel safe enough to cry. And I needed to change that, even if the way to do it was through silence. Because sometimes loving isn't about asking. It's about waiting for the moment when the other person is finally able to speak. The changes didn't happen all at once. They came quietly, just like my daughter always was when something bothered her. At first, I thought it was just tiredness, too much work, a heavy routine, the normal worries of adult life. She would wake up nauseous some mornings, but said it was anxiety. She would arrive home earlier, go straight to her room, close the door carefully as if she didn't want to bother anyone. Her way of dressing changed gradually. Looser clothes, blouses she didn't wear before, dresses that were kept at the back of the closet. Nothing screamed pregnancy, but everything whispered, something's wrong. I could tell by the way she sat at the table. She ate less. She pushed her plate away. Sometimes she would get up too quickly and go to the bathroom, saying she wasn't feeling well. The people around didn't notice anything, and that hurt me more than if they had noticed. "She's doing great," they said, always so calm. "Your daughter is so strong." Strong. That word has always bothered me, because being strong often means simply learning not to ask for help. I observed everything. The way she held her belly without realizing it. The way she took a deep breath before answering simple questions. The prolonged silence when someone spoke of the future, plans, changes. And I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't want to ask, but because I knew that if I asked, she would withdraw even more. I started doing something that I now call an invisible test. Nothing planned, nothing conscious for her. I created spaces. Spaces for conversation without direct questions. Spaces for presence without obligation. I would sit next to her on the sofa and talk about my youth, about mistakes I made, about fears I had, about things I hid when I was younger. I wanted her to understand, without explicitly saying so, that making mistakes doesn't destroy a woman. That disappointment is part of life. That a mother's love doesn't end with difficult news. Sometimes I would casually comment, "Life is funny. Just when you think you have everything under control, it turns everything upside down." She was listening to me, but she didn't say anything. Other times, I would say, "If you ever need me, even if it's for something scary, I'm here." She smiled, that short, restrained smile, and she replied, "I know, Mom," but I felt it still wasn't enough. There was something bigger, something too heavy to come off easily. The weeks went by, and the signs became clearer. The smell of coffee began to bother her. She avoided certain foods. She slept more than usual. There was one day when I almost asked. She was sitting at the table, pale, holding her glass with both hands. I opened my mouth and closed it, because I saw in her eyes a fear that didn't need a question. It needed time. I also noticed something even more painful. She was trying hard to appear normal. She laughed when she needed to. She replied to messages. She went out when invited even when she didn't want to. It was as if he were acting out his own life. And that broke my heart. I knew she was carrying something big, but I needed to understand, which didn't trust him enough to tell him. Afraid of myself, afraid of judgment, afraid of disappointing, or fear of what that truth would change forever. That's when I decided to remain silent, not out of inaction, but out of caution. I wanted her to speak when she was ready, not when she was pressured. I wanted the truth to come safely, not ripped away. Inside, I cried alone. At night, lying down, staring at the ceiling. I was thinking, am I making a mistake? Am I being absent? Is my silence hurting more than helping? But every time I imagined forcing that conversation, I felt I would lose something precious. Her trust. And I didn't want to be just another person in her life demanding answers when all she needed was support. So I continued watching every gesture, every sigh, every silence. Until one day, watching her leave the house, I thought something that hurt more than any certainty. I don't need to know right now if she's pregnant. I need to know if she feels lonely. And at that moment, I understood that the conflict wasn't the pregnancy. It was the fear she felt of facing it without support. That's why I waited. Because, more than discovering a secret, I needed to find out if my daughter trusted me enough to share her own pain. There was one particular day when I almost broke everything I had decided up to that point. It wasn't a big event. It wasn't a discussion. It was something simple and precisely for that reason, devastating. We were alone in the kitchen. The house was silent. The afternoon was too hot for the time of day. My daughter was sitting at the table, elbows propped up, staring at a fixed point on the wall. The plate in front of her was practically untouched. "Aren't you going to eat?" I asked, trying to sound natural. She took a deep breath before answering. Soon, that response had become standard. "In a little while. Nothing right now. I'm not hungry." I reached over to get a glass from the cupboard, and in that simple movement, I realized something my heart already knew, but my mouth hadn't yet dared to say. When she stood up from the chair, she put her hand to her stomach. It wasn't a conscious gesture. It was instinct. A quick gesture. Almost invisible. But I saw it. My whole body reacted before my mind. I felt a tightness in my chest. My legs went heavy. For a second, it seemed like I couldn't breathe. There was the confirmation I had been avoiding facing directly. It was no longer just a suspicion. It was a certainty. My daughter was pregnant, and it wasn't a recent pregnancy. She sat back down, noticed my gaze, and quickly changed her posture as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. She smiled that short, defensive smile. "Everything's fine, Mom." That sentence hurt more than any revelation, because everything wasn't all right. And we both knew it. At that moment, I almost asked. Almost. The words came right to the tip of their tongues. "Are you pregnant? Why didn't you tell me? What's going on?" But I swallowed it all, because when I looked at her face, I didn't see guilt. I saw fear. A deep fear. Raw. Unprotected. The fear of carrying something too big alone. She looked away and started talking about small things. About work. About an overdue bill. About some silly problem. And I realized that the conversation wasn't about the topic she was bringing up. It was about what she was avoiding. Inside, I was shattered. As a mother, everything inside me screamed to protect her. To tell her that everything would be all right. To assure her that she wouldn't be alone. But I knew with painful clarity, if I had asked her at that moment, she wouldn't have felt welcome. She would have felt cornered. I needed to understand the magnitude of the fear before touching on the secret. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, reliving every little sign from the past few months. Everything made sense now. Nausea, tiredness, loose clothing, the profound silence. And along with the certainty came a question that pierced me like a knife. Why doesn't my daughter feel safe telling me? That question was more painful than the pregnancy itself. I went back in time, to my own youth. I remembered how many times I hid things for fear of disappointing others. How many times I smiled when I wanted to cry. How many decisions I made alone because I thought I wouldn't have support. And there, in that early morning, I understood something that both broke me and matured me at the same time. My daughter wasn't hiding a pregnancy. She was hiding her fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of the reaction. Fear of not being enough. Fear of disappointing the very person she loved most. In the following days, the tension grew. Every gesture she made hurt me and demanded self-control from me. She would feel unwell in the mornings and say it was a virus. She would refuse invitations, saying she was tired. She would change the subject whenever someone mentioned future plans. And I continued in silence. A silence that was not indifference. It was loving vigilance. But there was another moment, an even more difficult one. One afternoon, a relative commented, without malice, "And children, do you plan on having any someday?" My daughter froze. Literally, the glass she was holding trembled. Her smile vanished. I felt the urge to scream, to interrupt, to protect. But I didn't say anything. I observed. She replied with something vague, almost automatic. One day. Who knows? And that's when I saw tears in her eyes. Quick, suppressed. She got up and went to her room. I sat there, heartbroken, trying to convince myself that this silence was still necessary. But it was on that day that I understood something essential. The conflict was not with she was pregnant. The conflict was so long she was carrying it all by herself. I began to realize that it wasn't just about whether or not she would tell me. It was about her allowing herself to be cared for. And that required something I hadn't yet fully guaranteed her: emotional security. So I started changing small things. I didn't ask direct questions, but I made statements. Nothing you tell me will push me away from you. I've lived long enough to know that life doesn't follow perfect plans. I didn't create you to please me. I created you to live with. She listened. Sometimes she cried without realizing it. Sometimes she just changed the subject. But something was happening. The fear was still there, but I was no longer so alone. I also started to notice that the pregnancy was already past its early stages. 3 months. Maybe more. Her body showed it. Her exhaustion showed it. Her excessive care with certain movements showed it. And this brought a new kind of pain. She was going through all of this without emotional support. At that stage, I had to fight against the strongest maternal instinct there is, the instinct to solve everything. Because I knew that if I intervened, it wouldn't grow. If I invaded, it would shut itself off. So I waited. Each day was an exercise in restraint. I prayed. I talked to myself. I asked for strength not to turn love into pressure. Until one quiet night, she sat down next to me on the sofa. He didn't say anything for a few minutes. He just breathed deeply. I didn't say anything either. The silence that time was different. It wasn't escape. It was preparation. She brought her hand to her face, wiped away a tear that had fallen without warning, and said, her voice trembling, "Mom, have you ever been afraid of something good?" My heart almost stopped. I knew it. It was there. But that moment was not yet the revelation. It was the last step before it. I answered calmly, even though my chest was burning. Yes, many times. She nodded. She looked at the floor. She took another deep breath. And he said nothing more. But at that moment, I understood with absolute clarity. The problem was never the pregnancy itself. The problem was always the fear of facing it without support. And my silence, up until then, had served that purpose, to show that I was there without demanding, without pressuring, without judging. I didn't know when she would tell me, but I knew it was coming soon. Because, at that moment, for the first time, she didn't walk away. She stayed. And I knew that the climax wouldn't be the shock of the pregnancy being revealed, but the relief of no longer having to carry that burden alone. There, in that shared silence, I understood that sometimes love needs to wait to be heard at the right moment. After that night on the couch, nothing was said, but everything had been felt. I went to my room with my heart racing, as if I had just run an emotional marathon. I closed the door slowly, so as not to make a sound, and sat on the bed without even changing my clothes. That's where the downfall began. Because, when the silence finally rested solely with me, the questions I had been avoiding for months finally came. Where did I fail? At what point did my daughter learn to hide her pain from me? When did fear begin to speak louder than trust? I always thought I was a present mother, maybe even too much so. I've always been there for everything. The falls, the tears, the decisions, the mistakes, the successes. I've always said you could count on me. And even so, she had been pregnant for months without being able to tell me. This realization hurt more than any external judgment could have. I got up, walked around the dark room, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet. I ran my hand over my face, as if I could erase the feeling of guilt that was settling in my chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was something much deeper. It was the feeling of having been spared, when I wanted to have been chosen. I sat down again and began to remember myself at her age. I remembered how many times I also kept quiet about big things. How many times I hid tears so as not to worry my mother. How many decisions I made alone because I thought I wouldn't be understood. And for the first time, something started to make sense. Perhaps my daughter wasn't hiding the pregnancy from me. Perhaps she was hiding it to protect herself. Protecting myself. Protecting herself. protecting an image she believed she needed to maintain. This realization didn't eliminate the pain, but it changed where it was located. That morning, I cried silently. I didn't cry out of fear of the future. I cried because of the weight my daughter was carrying alone. I cried imagining how many nights she must have spent awake, hand on her belly, thinking about everything that could go wrong. I cried imagining the fear of disappointing her. I cried for not realizing sooner how lonely she was. And amidst those stifled tears, another question arose, an even more difficult one. Could I have unknowingly taught my daughter to hide things? Did I teach you something when I downplayed small pains in the past? When I said it will pass too quickly? When I tried to be strong all the time? That question crushed me, because there's no manual for being a mother. And even when trying to do it right, sometimes we create silences unintentionally. The next day, I woke up feeling different. I didn't say anything about the conversation from the previous night. I didn't change my tone. I didn't ask any questions, but I was more alert than ever. I watched how she moved around the house, how she breathed, how she avoided certain topics. I saw the weariness etched on their shoulders. I saw the effort to appear normal. And every time someone asked, "Is everything all right?" I realized how superficial that question was for what it contained. I myself have asked this question thousands of times in my life. And how many times has it been answered with "everything's fine" that meant nothing? That made me understand something important. Truth is not born from pressure. It is born from security. And at that moment, my daughter still didn't feel safe enough. That didn't mean she didn't trust me. It meant that fear was still stronger. This realization presented me with a difficult decision. Either I broke the silence to ease my anguish, or I maintained the silence to protect her time. And I chose to keep waiting. It wasn't easy. Each bout of nausea she experienced was a test of my self-control. Each loose garment was a scream I needed to ignore. Each longer silence tore me apart inside. There were days when I went into the bathroom, closed the door, and cried quietly so I wouldn't be heard. There were days when I almost asked directly. Almost. But something always held me back. I was certain that if I asked too early, the conversation would start off on the wrong foot. It would begin with fear, with defensiveness, with justifications. And I didn't want justifications. I wanted trust. I wanted her to feel supported when she spoke, not trapped. Even so, the guilt wouldn't leave me alone. Guilt for waiting. Guilt for suffering in silence. Guilt for not acting as the world expects a mother to act. One day, a friend of mine told me, without knowing anything about it, if she were my daughter, I would have already gotten the truth out of her. That phrase echoed in my head for hours. Was I being negligent? Was I being too harsh? Would my silence be interpreted as disinterest? These thoughts almost made me give up. But then I remembered my daughter's gaze that night on the sofa. The way she asked, with fear and hope mixed together, "Have you ever been afraid of something good?" That wasn't resistance. That was a cry for help. And requests for help need to be heard at the pace of the person asking. During that time, I also had to deal with another difficult feeling, the fear of what she was facing alone. Pregnancy isn't just about anticipation. It's about the body changing, hormones, insecurity, plans crumbling and being rebuilt at the same time. And I knew that, even though I was there physically, emotionally she was still alone. That awareness was tearing me apart. But it also made me act differently. I started being more present without being intrusive, keeping her company without asking questions, cooking something she liked and leaving it on the table without comment, small gestures that said, without words, "I am here," and something began to change. She started spending more time near me. She would sit in the same room unnecessarily. Sometimes she would start talking, and then stop. I didn't finish the job. I didn't push. I waited. This waiting was painful, but it was a conscious decision. Until one night, after a difficult day for her, I saw her come home with swollen eyes. It wasn't recent crying. It was suppressed crying. She looked at me, opened her mouth as if to say something, and then gave up. At that moment, my heart almost couldn't take it. I meant to say, "You can speak. I know. There's no need to be afraid." But I didn't say that, because I realized she wasn't ready to say everything yet. But she was getting close, and I needed to respect that process. That night, alone in my room, I accepted something very difficult. Perhaps my daughter was suffering not because I failed, but because growing up hurts. And perhaps my role, at that moment, was not to solve the problem but to support it. To endure the silence. To endure the waiting. To endure the pain without turning it into a demand. That's when I understood that this phase wasn't just a downfall for her. It was a downfall for me too. The downfall of the mother who solves everything. The fall of the certainty of control. The fall of the illusion that love always knows what to do. But along with that fall came something new. The maturity to understand that loving also means enduring one's own anguish. And I held on. I held back every question, every impulse, every tear, because I needed the truth. But I needed it to come without fear. Even if it cost me sleepless nights, even if it hurt, I was ready to listen. I just needed her to feel ready to speak. The revelation did not come at a planned time. There was no announcement. There was no preparation. It came to light in the way that the deepest truths often do, when the body can no longer bear the silence. It was late afternoon. The house was too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't rest, it weighs you down. I was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove without paying attention to what I was doing, when I felt her presence behind me. I didn't need to look to know. Mothers know. She stood there for a few seconds without saying anything, just long enough for me to sense that something was about to happen. "Mom," she said, her voice different. It wasn't crying yet. It was something before crying. I turned off the stove slowly. I turned to face her, and I waited. I didn't ask what. I didn't ask if everything was all right. I just waited. She sat at the table, rested her elbows on it, brought her hands to her face, and stayed there, breathing deeply, like someone gathering courage to jump from a high place. "I need to tell you something," she said, almost in a whisper. At that moment, everything inside me tightened. Even hearing it still hurt. I sat across from her. I didn't touch her. I didn't interrupt. "I'm very scared," she continued. "Scared of your reaction. Scared of disappointing you. Scared of not being able to handle it." When she lifted her face, her eyes were already brimming with tears. And there was no guilt there. There was exhaustion. "I'm pregnant, Mom." The words fell upon us like something heavy, even though it was already expected. For a second, the world went silent. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I needed to choose how to say it. She started talking fast, stumbling over her sentences, as if she needed to justify herself before I had time to react. "I know it's not the right time. I know you're going to think a lot of things. I tried to solve it on my own. I tried to be strong, but I can't." She stopped, placed her hand on her stomach, as if apologizing to someone invisible. "It's been 3 months already," she said, crying. 3 months pretending everything was normal. There, my heart broke in silence. Not because of the pregnancy itself, but because of the burden she carried alone for so long. I took a deep breath. I held back my own tears. And then I spoke. "I know." She looked at me, startled. "What do you mean? You know?" I reached my hand across the table. She hesitated for a second, but took it. "I noticed," I said calmly. "The nausea, the tiredness, the way you were hiding. I noticed." Her eyes widened. "And why didn't you say anything?" This question was loaded with everything. Fear, confusion, maybe even a hint of resentment. It was there that I revealed what mattered most. "Because I didn't stay silent to catch you," I said. "I stayed silent to protect you." She started to cry for real. That kind of crying that comes from deep within, without restraint. "I was so afraid you'd get angry, that you'd be disappointed in me." I squeezed her hand more firmly. "Daughter, I didn't stay silent because I don't care. I stayed silent because I wanted you to speak when you felt safe, not when you were cornered." She shook her head, crying. "I thought you'd think I failed, that I ruined everything." That sentence hurt more than any other, because no pregnancy is a mess, but the fear of disappointing a mother can turn any joy into guilt. "Look at me," I said. She lifted her face, her eyes red. "I'm not disappointed in you. I'm sad because you thought you had to suffer alone." She put her hand to her chest, as if that had broken something inside. "I was afraid of losing you." That's when I couldn't take it anymore. I got up from my chair and hugged her. It wasn't a restrained hug. It was a hug of someone holding on tight so as not to let her fall. She clung to me like a little child. She cried on my shoulder like she hadn't cried since she was a little girl. "I'm here," I said, repeating it several times. "I'm here." Her crying gradually subsided, giving way to heavy, tired breathing. When we let go, she still seemed fragile, but something had changed. The weight was no longer solely on her. "I thought that if I spoke, you would pressure me," she confessed. "I didn't know how to explain, or even what I was feeling. And you didn't need to know," I replied. "You just needed to know that you wouldn't be alone." She remained silent for a few seconds, caressing her own belly, now without hiding it. "I wish I had spoken up sooner," she said softly. "You spoke in your own time," I replied. "And that's what matters." There, in that simple moment, without shouting, without accusations, without sermons, something was rebuilt between us. It wasn't just a conversation about pregnancy. It was a conversation about trust, about fear, about acceptance. I understood that the silence I maintained was not in vain. It didn't push him away, it prepared the ground. And she understood that she didn't need to carry the weight of the world alone to deserve love. We stayed there for a while, speaking little. Sometimes silence can be soothing too. Before going to sleep, she hugged me again. "Thank you for not pressuring me," she said. "Thank you for waiting." I smiled, even with tears in my eyes. "Sometimes, daughter," I said, "love needs to wait to be heard." That night, I slept differently. Not because everything was resolved, but because, for the first time in months, the truth was out of the shadows. And that, in itself, was already liberating. After that conversation, nothing magically changed. And perhaps that was the most honest part of it all. The pregnancy continued. The fears too. The questions about the future hadn't disappeared. But something essential had changed. She was no longer alone. In the following days, I noticed small gestures that spoke louder than any speech. She started leaving her room more often. She would sit with me in the living room without any rush. Sometimes we wouldn't say anything, and yet there was company. Before, she would eat quickly and go to bed. Now, she would sit at the table. She would ask simple questions. She would talk about her day. It was as if, little by little, the burden had been divided. And I changed too. I began to look at her more carefully, not with the kind of watching over her, but with the kind of welcoming. I didn't ask too many questions. I didn't give advice unless asked. I learned that protecting isn't about controlling. It's about being available. There were difficult conversations, of course, about the child's father, about work, about money, about judgments. But none of these conversations were filled with accusations. They were filled with fear. Yes, but also with truth. One night, she told me something that stuck with me. "Mom, I thought I needed to be ready to talk, but I just needed to feel safe." That hit me hard, because I realized that often, children don't hide things because of a lack of love. They hide them because they're afraid of losing what they love most. Over time, I watched my daughter recover something that had been broken long ago, the confidence to be herself, even when she doesn't have all the answers. She started talking more about her feelings, admitting when she was tired, saying when she was scared. And I made it clear, in every gesture, that she would not be judged there. Gradually, she also began to touch her belly more, not as someone carrying a burden, but as someone beginning to accept a reality. One day, she called me over to sit next to her on the bed. "Can you feel it?" he asked, placing my hand there. At that moment, I understood that something profound had changed. It wasn't just about a baby. It was about bonding. It was about her knowing that she could share her life with me, including the imperfect parts. People around started to notice the change. "You two are closer now," someone commented. And we really were. Not because I watched, not because I pressured, but because I waited. I learned, in that process, that silence can also be a place of love when it comes not from fear, but from respect. And she learned that speaking up doesn't have to be an act of solitary courage, it can be a gesture of confidence. Today, when I think about all of this, I know that initial silence wasn't omission. It was space. Space for her to choose when to speak. Space for the truth to come out undefended. Space for love not to feel like a demand. Our relationship didn't go back to how it was before. It became more real, less idealized, more human, and that is liberating. Because I didn't need to be the perfect mother, and she didn't need to be the strong daughter all the time. We just needed to be honest with each other. Sometimes love doesn't need immediate words. It needs time. And in that silence that so many might judge, we found understanding. Today, when I look at my daughter, I know I made the right choice. Not because she remained silent, but because she was present. Because, in the end, the silence that comforts can be more powerful than 1,000 questions. And that's how, without realizing it, we both freed ourselves. Today, when I think about everything I experienced with my daughter during that period, I understand something that took me many years to learn. Not all silence is abandonment. Some silences are signs of care. We live in a world that demands quick answers, immediate explanations, and ready reactions. But the human heart doesn't work at that pace. Sometimes a person doesn't stay silent because they lack trust. They stay silent because they are still trying to understand their own pain. I could have pressed harder. I could have asked direct questions. I could have demanded the truth sooner rather than later. Perhaps I would have had the answer sooner, but I would have lost something far more valuable: trust. When someone carries something too heavy inside, what that person needs most is not judgment. It's security, confidence to speak without fear, confidence to cry without shame, confidence to make mistakes without being discarded. Many mothers, many fathers, many children live with silent conflicts like this. A hidden secret, an unspoken pain, a fear that grows in the dark. And almost always, the problem isn't what was hidden. It's the fear of the reaction when the truth comes out. I learned that listening begins long before words. It begins with eye contact, with posture, with the way of being present without intruding. I learned that love isn't about extracting truths. It's about creating a place where they can land. If I had turned my silence into a demand, my daughter might have spoken, but she would have spoken out of fear, defensively, guilty. And I didn't want a confession. I wanted a connection. Today, when I see my daughter more confident, more open, more genuine, I know that the wait was worth it. Not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Not all silence is a demand. Not all silence is indifference. Sometimes it's a hug that hasn't yet found the words. If you're a mother, father, daughter, or son, if there is something that someone close to you hasn't yet been able to say, perhaps the question isn't, why don't you speak? Perhaps it's, what can I do to make you feel safe to talk? And if you're the one keeping something to yourself, know this: speaking up doesn't have to be a solitary act of courage. It could be a gesture of shared love. Sometimes all that's missing is someone willing to listen without correcting, without accusing, without jumping to conclusions. Silence, when born of love, does not distance. It prepares. Prepare the ground so that the truth doesn't hurt more than necessary. If this story touched you in any way, I invite you to reflect. Have you ever hidden something for fear of disappointing someone you love? Or have you ever stayed silent hoping someone would trust you? If you'd like, share it in the comments. Your story could help someone else who is still unable to speak. Like and follow the channel. Here, we don't force confessions. We respect the timing of the heart. Because some truths can only be born when they find acceptance.